Okay, in this video, I'm going to cover activity-based costing, which is Managerial Chapter 17. So there are three different ways that we can allocate overhead. So remember, overhead are all of the indirect costs that have to do with manufacturing a product. So this could be depreciation on the factory, depreciation on the equipment, insurance on the factory. It could be indirect materials, indirect labor. The list really goes on and on. While it's very easy to allocate direct labor and direct materials because we can easily trace exactly how much we use to make each product, we know that overhead costs are very tricky to allocate. So we're going to look at three different methods that we can use to allocate overhead. And we will in detail go through each of these three methods in this video. The first one is plant-wide rate. That is the same method that we have used in the past when allocating overhead, but we're still going to go back through it. It is one rate that measures typically direct labor hours. It could also be machine hours, maybe even the direct materials. I don't think that's the best measurement the majority of the time, but it's going to have one rate based on the volume on a certain activity. Second, we have departmental rate. There we consider the fact that in the manufacturing process, each product is going to go through two or more departments in order to be completed. So you're going to have two or more rates. Then finally, we'll have activity-based costing. This is our trickiest but most accurate method. So we are going to think about each of the costs that are incurred in overhead costs, and we are going to pull those together, and then we will figure out a rate for each of those pulls based on their cost drivers. So let's get started with the plant-wide overhead rate. So we're going to see this little diagram and something very similar over and over again throughout this chapter. The first thing we have to figure out is the estimated overhead cost. That's the indirect cost, all of those put together. So that's what you see at the top here. Then we come up with our single plant-wide overhead rate, which I'm going to remind you how we calculate that in just a minute. And then we allocate that rate to each product based on the activity driver. So remember, when it comes to that plant-wide rate, well, we're going to look at the formula in a second, but for this example, all through this chapter, we are going to talk about go-karts. I don't know about you, but I enjoy riding go-karts as long as they're not crazy fast. So we know that for this company, they are planning to produce 5,000 standard go-karts. This is just what you're typically going to see at a fun park, just standard. Hey, let's just order some go-karts. Don't need anything custom. So they're planning to make 5,000 of those. Our activity base is going to be direct labor hours in this example. And they say it takes 15 direct labor hours to produce a standard go-kart. So if we have 5,000 go-karts times 15 direct labor hours, it will take a total of 75,000 hours to make these standard go-karts. This company also sells custom go-karts. So I guess if you got a lot of money to spend, you can have a go-kart custom made for your home life, for your company. So maybe these have some custom designs. Maybe they're shaped like some kind of awesome fast animal like a cheetah. But whatever it is, we've got custom go-karts here. Maybe they have turbo or something like that. But they are planning to make 1,000 of those, and those take longer to make. So we're going to multiply that times 25 hours per, which gives us 25,000 hours to make the custom go-karts. When we add those together, we say we are going to spend a total of 100,000 hours making these two types of go-karts. We got two products. Our overhead cost, we are estimating, is going to total 4,800,000. So remember, with that plant-wide overhead rate, just like we did in previous chapters, We take the total budgeted or total estimated overhead cost, which we saw was 4.8 million, divided by the total budgeted direct labor hours or whatever the activity base is. So we'll divide it by the total 100,000 hours. That gives us $48 per direct labor hour. So based on how many hours it ends up taking, we are going to apply our overhead at $48 per direct labor hour. So now we're looking at that same visual, but we filled in some numbers. So now we know that our overhead cost is estimated or budgeted to be 4.8 million. Our plant-wide overhead rate was calculated by taking the total budgeted overhead cost divided by the total expected direct labor hours. That gave us $48 per hour. Then we come down to each individual product. We have two for this example. The standard go-karts, we take the $48 per direct labor hour times the 15 hours that we saw up here it takes to make it. So for each and every standard go-kart, we would allocate $720 of overhead costs to that unit. We still have direct labor costs and direct material costs to get all of our manufacturing costs. But for overhead, for standard go-karts, we will apply $720. For the custom go-karts, we're going to use that same $48 per direct labor hour that we calculated times the 25 direct labor hours that is expected to be needed to make each one. So the overhead cost assigned to each of the custom go-karts is $1,200. This wasn't something we calculated, they just gave it to us, but direct materials for standard was $400. Direct labor was $350. When we add the $720 that we calculated for standard go-karts, we see our total product cost or our manufacturing cost are $1,470. For custom go-karts, we're going to take the $600 they're just giving to us, plus the $500 plus the $1,200 that we calculated. That tells us our manufacturing product costs are $2,300. So that's just the manufacturing cost. So we would want to charge, more than whatever amount the manufacturing cost is. So that was our plant-wide overhead rate. Now let's move on to our departmental overhead rate. This is extremely similar, so try to think of it that way. The only thing is we are splitting it up into different departments that our product is going to go through in order to be completely manufactured. So we're going to start with the overhead cost. It's still going to be the 4.8 million, but we're going to break that out into each department. It's going to be two or more. For our example, it will be two departments. We calculate the rate for that department, and then we break it into the products. So let's look at the example of that. Again, we know the overhead costs are 4.8 million. Now they're telling us that 4.2 million goes into the machining department and the 600,000 left over is assembly. So that's going to be our estimated overhead cost, or our numerator, when calculating the rates for each of these departments. All right, so when we come over here, we say, okay, to make a standard go-kart, we know we're going to make 5,000. For the machining department, obviously we're going to base it on machine hours. How long does a standard go-kart go through the machine? How long does a custom go-kart use machine time? So it takes 10 machine hours per unit times the 5,000 units. So it takes 50,000 machine hours to produce these 5,000 standard go-karts. The custom go-karts, we see it takes 20 machine hours to make one. 20 machine hours times 1,000 units equals 20,000 machine hours. So total machine hours, when we add these up, is 70,000. Then we come over here to the assembly department. Each of them take 5 direct labor hours in assembly. So we simply take the number of go-karts for each one times the 5 direct labor hours and that will give us a total of 30,000 direct labor hours to make the two different types of go-karts. So we're just going to take the same formula, except we're going to do it per department. We are going to take the total budgeted department overhead cost. So for machining, it'd be 4.2 million divided by the total departmental allocation base. So for machining, it would be 70,000 machine hours. For assembly, it would be 600,000 would be our numerator. That's the budgeted overhead cost for that department, divided by the 30,000 direct labor hours. So now we have $60 per machine hour is our rate for machining, and $20 per assembly for our per direct labor hour for assembly. So we plug those amounts in right here. Machining was the $60 per machine hour, assembly was $20 per direct labor hour. And then for the standard go-kart, it's going to take 10 machine hours times the $60 per hour gives us 600. For the assembly department, it was $20 times the 5 direct labor hours, that gives us $100. So for the standard go-kart, we're just going to add those two costs together and we say, okay, it's going to cost us $700 simply an overhead cost to make the standard whenever we break it down by departments. The custom go-kart, we say, okay, it takes 20 machine hours. We multiply that times the $60 per machine hour to get 1,200. For assembly, we take our $20 per direct labor hour times our 5 direct labor hours. That gives us 100. We add those together. We say, hey, our overhead cost allocated to each and every custom go-kart is $1,300. This gives us a more accurate look at the, let me stay here for a second, at what goes on and how we should apply the overhead cost, because we're breaking it out saying, hey, let's consider how long it's taking in each department, and maybe direct labor hours is not what you want to base all of your allocation on. Now, if we were to get even more in detail, which guess what, we are going to do activity-based costing. Again, we're going to start with the same overhead cost. We'll start with that 4,800,000, but this time we're going to identify every activity, every cost that goes into our factory overhead, our indirect cost. We're going to break those into activity cost pools, and then we are going to do the same thing, find a rate for each one, and then allocate them to each of the products. So this is the most tricky method, but it's also the most accurate. That's why we use it for our internal, for managerial accounting, while the plant-wide department rate is what we are going to use for generally accepted accounting principles. So step 1, we are going to identify all the activities and the overhead costs that they cause. So here, the company has identified 6 different activities that go into factory overhead. We've got machine setup, engineer salaries, machine repair, assembly line power, factory maintenance, heating and lighting. Now, as you can imagine, we're not going to use direct labor hours for each and every one of these. Would it make sense for factory maintenance to be direct labor hours, or for heating and lighting to have direct labor hours be its base? No, for both of those, I would pair those together and use square footage of the factory to allocate those. So what the company is going to do at this point is go through and say, which ones of these have the same base? And we are going to group those together in cost pools. But first, we have to figure out exactly how much each of those cost us. So machine setup costs $700,000. Machine repair, 1.3 million, and so on. When we take the 6 activity drivers, or the 6 activities themselves, and we add those costs all together, that's going to be our 4.8 million. If you don't get the 4.8 million here, we must have left some activity off or not put the right amount beside it. Okay, so now, as I said, we're going to come up with, or management comes up with, we don't have to figure it out, comes up with the different activity cost pools. So the first cost pool they come up with is craftsmanship. Then they have one for setup, one for design modification, and then one for plant services. So they're going to take those 6 different costs and group them into these 4 pools. So here's how they did it. They said assembly line power is going to be craftsmanship. So that's all by itself. It's going to be that $600,000. The setup, they said, hey, machine setup and machine repair, we're going to base those on the same thing. We're going to group them together into a cost pool called setup. So we add those 2 together to get a $2 million total. Design modification, that's going to be our engineer salaries. Those engineers are making some good money. They're making 1.2 million. Of course, I don't know how many engineers there are, so that would be something I would be interested in. Plant services, as I said, we're probably going to want to group the factory maintenance and heating and lighting together. When we take their costs into consideration and add them together, that cost pool, the plant services, is going to be a total of $1 million. When we add all of the pool costs together, we get that 4.8 million. So now for each of the 4 activity cost pools, we want to figure out what their activity overhead rate is. So we need to make sure that we properly identify the factor that drives the cost. What is it that would be the best way to allocate it? I'm not going to say factory maintenance is based on machine hours if we're talking about maintaining the cleanliness of the factory. That has nothing to do with machine hours. So I'm not going to say that the engineers are based on the square footage. The engineers and square footage have nothing to do with each other. We want to make sure that we properly measure these activities. So we, again, to figure out the rate for each cost pool, we're going to take the overhead cost assigned to the pool divided by the expected activity level. So for the first one, we know that the craftsmanship cost pool was $600,000. That was just the assembly line power. We're going to divide that by, they've come up with direct labor hours is the best way to allocate that. And they're telling us the direct labor hours was $30,000. I believe it was $25,000 for standard and $5,000 for custom, if I'm recalling correctly. So that would give us for the craftsmanship activity cost pool, it would be $20 per direct labor hour. So here's how each of them look. Craftsmanship, we just said, is based on direct labor hours. There's 30,000 direct labor hours. Setup, they said they're going to consider batches for the setup. How many batches do we have to do? And they said there's 200 batches expected throughout the year. For design modification, that's our engineer salaries. We say, let's base it on how many designs they make. And then we have to figure out, okay, they make 10 new design modifications throughout the year. And finally, we have the plant services that had to do with factory maintenance and our heating and lighting. And they are going to base that on the square footage. They say the total factory square footage is 20,000. So we're going to take whatever the cost was assigned to each of these pools divided by their activity driver. So again, there's the craftsmanship that we said was 600,000. We divide it by the 30,000 direct labor hours, and we are going to assign $20 per direct labor hour. And here's the rest of them. The setup, we based it on batches. We said the total setup was $2 million. Divided by the 200 batches that they told us about, that means we're going to assign $10,000 per batch. The standard go-karts are going to use a different amount of batches than the custom go-karts. For design modifications, we said we're paying those engineers $1.2 million. They made 10 designs. When we divide 1.2 million divided by 10, we get $120,000 allocated to whichever go-karts needed the designs. Then we get plant services. We're basing it on square footage. The plant services are going to cost a total of $1 million divided by 20,000 square feet. So we are going to allocate it by $50 per square foot. It probably takes one type of go-kart more square footage in the factory than the other to produce. Then we multiply whatever their activity rate is by the actual activities. So for a standard go-kart, we said it takes 25,000 direct labor hours times the $20 per direct labor hour we calculated for the craftsmanship department. That gives us $500,000. Oh, this is an overwhelming diagram. It's the same information if you just look at it one thing at a time. There's the craftsmanship for what, the fourth time? 600,000 divided by the 30,000 direct labor hours. They came up with $20 per. So they said, okay, standard go-karts, you take 25,000 direct labor hours times 20, 500,000 of the 600,000 is going to be allocated to the standard go-karts. Custom go-karts, we're making 5,000 of those, or we're going to use 5,000 direct labor hours rather, times the $20. The other $100,000 is allocated to custom go-karts. And we'll do that for each and every activity cost pool. Notice the big difference because, wow, we now are allocating $3.3 million to our custom go-karts and only $1.5 million to our standard go-karts. Notice the big difference. The standard go-karts didn't have any new designs. That means all 10 designs belong to the custom go-karts. So all $1.2 million was assigned there. When we add together the totals, we get to that 4.8 million, which is great. We always want to reconcile to make sure we get back to that number. So that means that if we take the $1.5 million divided by the 5,000 standard go-kart units that they're going to produce, we are going to allocate only $300 per unit for standard. Meanwhile, custom go-karts, they have $3.3 million of overhead costs assigned to them, divided by the 1,000 go-karts they're planning to make. So instead of the, what was it, $1,200 in overhead costs that we initially wanted to assign, we more accurately need to assign $3,300 per unit. Big difference there. If we add in our direct materials and direct labor to the new overhead costs that we calculated, we see it costs a lot less to make the standard go-karts than we thought, and a lot more. Remember the first time the custom was going to be $2,300 in manufacturing costs. That's what we estimated with our plant overhead rate. But now that we've broken it down, really got to the nitty-gritty of what was causing these costs, we realize, wow, most of it is going to go to the custom go-karts. So in the end, this is how they compare the plant-wide method. We were going to assign way too little to the custom go-karts and way too much to the standard. Very similar results with departmental, but when we really broke down what was driving all these costs in activity-based costing, we say, wow, most of the cost needs to be allocated to the custom go-karts. So again, under generally accepted accounting principles, we would use the plant-wide method, but if we are looking at managerial accounting for internal users, it seems that it's wisest to use activity-based costing.